Hello, friends, and welcome back. I hope you're all doing well by God's grace. Let's start the second part of the episode. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button and join our YouTube family. The courtroom had already been tense that day, but the moment the document was introduced, the atmosphere changed completely. What had begun as another bitter legal confrontation suddenly turned into something far more dangerous. It was no longer just about words, accusations, or fractured relationships. It was about paper, signatures, ownership, intent. The kind of evidence that doesn't just wound reputations, but dismantles carefully built systems from the inside out. The clerk handed the papers to the bailiff, and from there they moved steadily to the judge's bench. Every eye in the room followed the file as if it were carrying a live charge. Christine sat still, but her posture had changed. She had spent much of the trial carrying herself with rigid control, as though one wrong breath might break apart the fragile strength she had assembled over years of disappointment, betrayal, and emotional exhaustion. But now there was something else in her expression. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even hope. It was recognition. She knew this paper mattered. Kody's attorney rose quickly, objecting almost before the judge had fully opened the file. He argued that the document was religious in nature, symbolic rather than binding, and therefore irrelevant to the matter at hand. He insisted it was part of a spiritual understanding, not a legal contract, and warned the court against assigning formal weight to something allegedly rooted in family custom rather than civil law. His tone was polished, measured, practiced. But underneath the performance was urgency. He knew the danger of the words on that page long before anyone else in the room heard them aloud. The judge read in silence for what felt like an unbearable stretch of time. No one shifted. No one coughed. Even the reporters seemed to hold back the scratch of their pens. Then, with the kind of cold clarity only a courtroom can produce, the judge looked up and delivered the sentence that shattered the room's last illusions. "This was no spiritual covenant," she said. This was a legal ambush clothed in religious language, and the court would treat it exactly that way. A tremor rippled through the gallery. It was subtle at first, a few gasps, a few exchanged glances, the unmistakable human sound of people realizing they were no longer witnessing family drama, but something far more destructive. Christine lowered her eyes for a moment, and when she was called to answer on the record, her voice shook. Not because she lacked conviction, but because conviction sometimes costs everything. She took a breath and said the words slowly, as if each one had been buried inside her for years. "He never meant to let me go clean," she said. "He wanted me to break. And when I didn't, he went after the one thing he thought would hurt me most. My children." The words landed harder than any theatrical outburst could have. Christine was not screaming. She was not trying to perform pain for sympathy. That was what made it devastating. Tears slid down her face, the first visible tears she had allowed herself in the trial, but they did not carry helplessness. They carried vindication. The kind of vindication that comes not from winning, but from finally seeing the machinery of your suffering named in public, with witnesses, under oath, where no one can gaslight it back into silence. Kody stood up so suddenly his chair scraped loudly across the floor. His face had lost whatever careful composure he had been trying to maintain. He shouted that it wasn't like that people didn't understand, that he was defending the structure of the family and trying to provide stability for the children. But the words no longer sounded like leadership. They sounded frantic, possessive, hollow. The judge cut him off with immediate force. One more outburst, she warned, and he would be removed from the courtroom. Kody sat back down, but he did not settle. His breathing was uneven. His eyes moved wildly from the bench to the attorneys to Christine, as though he were watching control slip away in real time and could not comprehend how quickly it was happening. The courtroom could see him now, stripped of narrative and posture. Not a patriarch. Not a victim. Not a misunderstood leader. Just a man who had confused control with love for so long that he no longer knew the difference. Christine's attorney rose again, and the next phase of the hearing pushed the room even further. He introduced a chain of emails exchanged between Kody and a property lawyer. They were dry in tone, technical in structure, the kind of correspondence people assume no one outside legal offices will ever read. But their content was explosive. In them, Kody discussed transferring family-linked homes into a trust that would be accessible only by himself and Robyn in the event Christine escalated legal action. There was no ambiguity in the strategy. It was preemptive, deliberate, and framed not as a family safeguard, but as a way to limit Christine's reach before she could challenge him. Then came the testimony of a real estate paralegal, a third-party witness with no emotional stake in the family, and therefore no reason to embellish. She explained that she had flagged one of the trust transfers as suspicious during routine review. According to her testimony, she had raised concerns about irregularities and was told directly by Kody that it was a spiritual family matter and none of her concern. The phrase hung over the room like smoke. A spiritual family matter. Again and again, the language of faith had been used not to protect people, but to silence them. The judge's face remained stern as the implications became impossible to ignore. What was emerging now was not merely evidence of favoritism or emotional cruelty. It was evidence of planning, methodical betrayal, financial cornering disguised as household management. Christine had not simply been left emotionally vulnerable. She had allegedly been maneuvered into legal and economic vulnerability before she had even spoken publicly about leaving. There is something especially chilling about betrayal when it is quiet. Loud betrayal can at least be recognized in the moment. It announces itself. It gives the victim a target. But this kind is different. It is scheduled. It is notarized. It arrives in spreadsheets, deeds, LLC filings, and strategic emails. It is hidden inside language like protection, consolidation, family structure, and best interests. And because it is dressed so neatly, it often gets mistaken for responsibility until the damage is already done. The judge ordered all relevant documents filed into court within 24 hours. She also cautioned Kody, in language that made even the gallery sit straighter, that asset protection undertaken in anticipation of litigation could approach fraud. It was not a final finding, but it was the kind of judicial warning that changes the temperature of a case. Suddenly, no one in the room was just thinking about divorce tensions or family dysfunction. They were thinking about legal exposure. Christine leaned toward her attorney and spoke quietly, but not quietly enough to escape the attention of those nearest her. She said she wanted sole custody. She said she did not trust him anymore, not after this. The statement was soft, but it carried the force of an earthquake because it marked a shift from grief to action. Christine was no longer standing there only to expose what had been done to her. She was preparing to protect what still remained in her hands. Janelle, seated nearby, gave a small nod and said, "Neither do I." In another moment, in another case, it might have seemed insignificant. But here, in this family, that agreement carried enormous weight. For years, the women had often been isolated from one another, divided by emotional loyalties, by household structure, by Kody's ability to frame one wife's concern as another wife's betrayal. That pattern was breaking. Publicly. Irreversibly. Christine then stated plainly, in full hearing of the court, that she was requesting immediate temporary custody and seeking a restraining order on Kody's access to shared legal funds. The judge acknowledged the request and instructed her counsel to provide the supporting documentation in the next session. That response did not grant the motion outright, but it legitimized it. The case had now expanded beyond old marital grievances into something more urgent: safety, guardianship, and financial containment. By the time the court recessed, the building felt transformed. Outside, reporters surged toward the steps as if they could smell blood in the air. Microphones lifted. Questions flew. Did Christine know about the clause? Was Robyn cooperating? Would Mary testify again? But the women said nothing. Not yet. Silence, for once, was not weakness. It was control. Elsewhere, away from cameras and benches and legal language, the emotional fallout was already beginning. In one imagined corner of Flagstaff, Robyn sat staring at a document with her own signature on it, asking how any of them had arrived at this point. In another, Kody raged in private with his attorney, less like a man mourning the loss of family and more like someone outraged that his system had stopped obeying him. His plan had not merely failed. It had been dragged into daylight. And daylight is fatal to systems built on selective truth. That night, while the media spun headlines and legal teams assembled new filings, Janelle sat at a kitchen table surrounded by papers. Receipts. Copies. Contracts. She went through them one by one, not with panic, but with the focus of someone who had finally accepted that memory alone would never be enough. Documentation was now survival. The future would not be shaped by who cried hardest or who spoke loudest. It would be shaped by what could be proven. Christine curled beside one of her daughters and whispered that it was almost over. But even as she said it, she knew better. It was not over. Not yet. Because when power begins to slip from someone who has built his identity around having the final say, he rarely lets go gracefully. He reaches. He blames. He claws. And this case was now moving into the most dangerous phase of all, the one where truth had enough evidence behind it to stop being dismissed. When the sixth session began, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Word had spread. What had once looked like another sensational family dispute was now being discussed as a potential fraud and custody case layered with forged records, unauthorized transfers, and the weaponization of spiritual language. The energy in the room was electric. Even before the judge entered, the spectators and media observers were buzzing with anticipation. This time it was Janelle who took the stand. She approached with none of Kody's theatrical agitation and none of Christine's visible heartbreak. Janelle brought something else entirely: documents. Her briefcase looked ordinary, but the way she carried it made it clear she knew exactly what it contained and exactly what it could do. She sat, was sworn in, and when invited to speak, she did so with the calm of someone who had spent years being underestimated. She told the court she was there to speak about the properties. The homes they had all lived in, funded, maintained, and been told belonged to the family. Homes that, according to her testimony, had in fact become tools of control. Bait, she called them, in a system designed to keep the wives compliant. It was not an emotional accusation. It was a structural one. Then she opened the case. Inside were copies of 6 property titles. One by one, she laid them out as the courtroom watched. They showed transfers from forms of shared or spiritually assumed ownership into LLCs controlled solely by Kody, and in some cases by Robyn as well. Some of these changes had occurred as early as 4 years before Christine ever left and well before Janelle herself had begun seriously considering separation. That timing mattered. It suggested this was not reactive chaos. It was advanced positioning. Janelle then presented a timeline. Each time concerns had been raised, she said, Kody reassured them that the arrangement was spiritual, not legal. That phrase again. Spiritual, not legal. It had become the shield behind which practical power was being consolidated. But Janelle had begun keeping records the moment she noticed that her name had been removed from the Coyote Pass land deed without her knowledge. The courtroom reacted audibly. Mary whispered that Kody had told her such discrepancies were clerical errors. Christine, stunned, said he had used the same explanation with her. Suddenly, the women's private confusions were aligning into a pattern. What each had once been encouraged to interpret as isolated mistakes now looked like repetition by design. Janelle continued. She described confronting Kody in 2021 after being told the title changes were merely part of financial consolidation to make loans easier. But then she saw bank statements. And from those statements, she said, it became clear that Robyn had refinanced one of the properties using it as collateral. Collateral, Janelle emphasized, that none of the other wives knew was legally under Robyn's control. The stillness in the courtroom at that moment was almost eerie. People were no longer reacting because the magnitude of the pattern had begun to exceed shock. Christine's attorney then moved to validate Janelle's claims with supporting documentation she had submitted the previous night. These included emails between Kody and a Flagstaff real estate broker discussing how to clean the titles before Christine notices. Robyn's name, according to the attorney, appeared multiple times in the correspondence as a co-applicant. The judge's expression hardened. Then came one of the most devastating moments of the day. The judge asked Janelle directly whether she had signed off on the transfers. Janelle answered no. Then she added that she had discovered her name forged on one of the original documents. She produced the page. Highlighted, marked, notarized, printed with a signature that she insisted was not hers. The room erupted. A forgery allegation takes a case into entirely different territory. Emotional betrayal can be argued over. Financial unfairness can be rationalized. But forgery is concrete. It suggests not just exclusion, but impersonation. Not just manipulation, but fraud with a pen. The judge immediately ordered that the signature be reviewed by an expert for authenticity at the next sitting. Kody leaned back in his chair, red-faced, arms crossed so tightly they looked almost painful. His attorney whispered furiously beside him, but the effort looked increasingly futile. The current had changed. This was no longer a courtroom listening politely to a messy family's grievances. It had become a venue for exposing a system in which legal paperwork and emotional hierarchy worked together to maintain control. Mary was then called forward, not to offer broad testimony, but to authenticate a document from 2016 listing her as co-signer on a house she had never occupied. She stared at it for so long that the silence itself became part of the testimony. Then, almost broken by the recognition, she whispered that she had never signed it and that it was not her handwriting. Her face folded into grief. Not outrage. Not vengeance. Grief. The grief of realizing that what she had once believed was partnership may have always been paperwork arranged around her rather than with her. The judge called a recess so the clerk could process the fresh evidence. In the hallways outside, chaos erupted. Reporters shouted over one another. Security struggled to control the flow of bodies and questions. And then Robyn arrived. Her entrance changed the atmosphere instantly. She no longer looked like the grieving, sheltered wife standing apart from the legal storm. There was something harder and sadder in her expression now. She did not sit beside Kody. She sat alone, 2 rows back, avoiding his eyes. Christine noticed first and whispered to Janelle that Robyn seemed to be separating herself from him. Janelle answered that she was surviving it. Whether that survival was guilt, strategy, fear, or all three at once, no one could yet say. When court resumed, Kody was asked directly whether he wished to respond to the accusations of forged documents and unlawful title transfers. He stood slowly, adjusted his tie, and claimed he did not recall authorizing anything illegal. He said his intention had always been to maintain the family framework. But the judge interrupted him with a stern reminder that intentions do not justify unauthorized financial conduct and that the court could now be looking at potentially criminal activity. That phrase settled like iron over the courtroom. Potentially criminal activity. It changed everything. Christine's attorney immediately moved to freeze the existing Brown family trust assets until an investigation could be completed. The judge granted the motion in principle, triggering the preparation of notifications to banks, insurers, and tax authorities. People in the gallery who had arrived expecting high drama now sat in stunned quiet, watching what looked less like a family argument and more like the collapse of a private empire built on unchallenged assumptions. Janelle stepped down from the stand without triumph. Her truth had done its work. Mary sat staring ahead, as if she were watching a house burn that she had spent years helping hold together. Christine, exhausted but sharper now, rose once more to make a claim for compensation based on unpaid spiritual labor and decades of family contribution. The theory was unusual, bold, and largely untested in Arizona civil proceedings, but the judge agreed to hear it in the next session. And that was the next frontier. The value of women's labor. Not only money transferred, properties taken, names removed, and titles forged, but years of unpaid caregiving, child rearing, business support, emotional management, household expansion, and invisible work done under a structure that promised belonging but delivered inequality. As the courtroom emptied for the day, Kody remained seated, staring at a page bearing his own signature as though it had become a death warrant for the world he once controlled. Robyn passed by him without a word, now accompanied by her own lawyer. Outside on the courthouse steps, Mary asked Christine and Janelle whether anyone could ever come back from this. Christine answered with quiet certainty. They were not going back, she said. They were starting over. And with that, the women descended the steps not in defeat, but in a fragile, hard-earned unity. Flashbulbs burst. Reporters shouted. Questions rained down. But the women kept walking, shoulders squared, no longer bound together by the illusion of spiritual harmony, but by something sturdier now: survival, truth, and the refusal to keep carrying someone else's lies. By the time the next session opened, the courthouse no longer felt like the setting of an ordinary civil dispute. It had turned into the center of a reckoning. Every bench was filled early. Every whisper carried urgency. Reporters crowded the perimeter, legal observers filled the gallery. And even those who had entered the trial expecting little more than family scandal now sat with the grave attention usually reserved for cases where consequences had outgrown the original accusations. This was no longer about private pain alone. It was about systems, financial, emotional, spiritual, and legal, being dragged into the light all at once. The prior session had already shifted the case into dangerous territory for Kody. Janelle's paperwork, Mary's shaken authentication, the allegations of forged signatures, and the judge's willingness to freeze trust assets had changed the tone completely. There was no easy way now to reduce what had happened to misunderstandings inside a complicated family arrangement. Too many documents existed. Too many patterns had emerged. Too many voices, once isolated, were beginning to speak in harmony. The old method of confusion, telling each wife a slightly different version of events and trusting that distance would keep them from comparing notes, was collapsing under the weight of evidence. When the judge entered, the entire room stood and then sat in a hush so complete it felt staged by fate itself. Christine was at her table, composed but visibly tired, the kind of tiredness that comes not from weakness, but from sustained vigilance. Janelle looked steady, nearly severe, her calm sharpened now into purpose. Mary sat with a faraway stillness that somehow seemed more devastating than tears. And Robyn, notably, remained apart. She had not resumed her place beside Kody. The separation was not dramatic, but it was impossible to miss. Kody looked different too. The polish was fading. The suit was still formal, but not immaculate. The confidence that had once seemed to animate him had turned brittle. He moved like a man still trying to project authority, while privately realizing that authority no longer produced the obedience it once had. There are moments when a public figure stops seeming large. Not because they physically shrink, but because the lens through which everyone sees them changes. That process had begun. Before Kody took the stand, Christine's attorney addressed the court on the issue of compensation for unpaid labor. It was, on paper, an unusual argument, and several in the room knew it. Arizona law had frameworks for fraud, custody, property, and restitution, but this claim reached into more difficult territory. It asked the court to recognize that years of labor raising children, supporting family businesses, maintaining shared homes, facilitating the family brand, and contributing to expansion projects had economic value even if the arrangement had been clothed in spiritual language instead of conventional employment agreements. What made the argument so potent was that it was not abstract. The women had not simply lived in a faith-based structure, they had worked inside it. Relentlessly. Tangibly. Profitably for others. The attorney framed it carefully. He did not ask the court to adjudicate theology or dismantle private belief. He asked the court to examine labor, benefit, dependency, and enrichment. If one party had materially benefited for years from the uncompensated work of others while simultaneously centralizing the legal ownership of assets generated through that collective labor, then the issue was no longer merely emotional unfairness. It was potentially unjust enrichment on a staggering scale. That language hit the room with special force because everyone present understood what had often gone unnamed in the family's public image. Behind every smiling statement about plural unity had been cooking, childcare, scheduling, moving, budgeting, emotional management, public appearances, unpaid business support. and the endless administrative labor of maintaining many lives under one highly unequal umbrella. The attorney argued that these contributions had been essential to the acquisition, upkeep, and presentation of family assets, yet the legal control of those assets had been concentrated elsewhere. The judge did not rule immediately, but she agreed to hear the matter in full. That alone sent a visible stir through the spectators. Even those unfamiliar with the finer details of civil theory could sense the significance. The case had moved beyond betrayal in the domestic sense and into a broader challenge: whether women's labor, hidden inside a religiously framed family system, could be measured, named, and compensated when the system collapsed. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Kody Brown was called to the stand. A strange silence took hold as he rose. This was the man around whom the entire family structure had supposedly revolved for years. The self-declared organizer, leader, husband, and protector. The one who, by his own framing, had shouldered the burden of the family's complexity. Yet, as he approached the witness stand, there was nothing kingly left in the walk. He looked like someone entering a room where his own words were waiting for him. He was sworn in. His attorney began gently, as expected, giving him room to tell his version of events. The opening questions were broad and almost sympathetic. How had he understood the family structure? What responsibilities had he carried? What pressures had come with trying to maintain harmony among multiple households? Kody answered in a controlled voice. At first, he sounded almost reasonable. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of leadership. He spoke of the burden of trying to hold together a large and complicated family under constant emotional strain. He implied that difficult decisions had been necessary, that some wives had not understood the full financial picture, that his actions had always been aimed at preserving long-term security. For a few minutes, it almost worked. He painted himself as the central stabilizing force in a chaotic environment. A man forced to make unpopular choices for the greater good. A manager of competing needs. A husband caught between loyalty, practicality, and spiritual duty. To listeners unfamiliar with the documents, it might even have sounded plausible. But that is the danger of practice self-narration. It can sound coherent right up until it meets the record. When Christine's attorney stood for cross-examination, the entire posture of the room changed. The first question was deceptively simple. Did Kody believe all 4 wives had been equal in the marriage? The question hung there longer than it should have. Kody paused. Too long. Then he answered that they were equal in spirit, but in reality someone had to take the lead. The phrase echoed strangely in the courtroom. Equal in spirit. Not in practice. Equal in theory. Not in power. Equal in sentiment. Not in ownership, not in access, not in legal standing. It was the kind of answer that accidentally reveals more than silence would have. A short, bitter laugh escaped Christine before she caught herself. The judge warned against disruptions, but the damage to Kody's framing had already been done. People shifted in their seats. Observers exchanged glances. The illusion that he had managed the family as a fair and burdened steward was weakening fast. The next questions came sharper. Had he transferred titles into Robyn's name without the informed consent of the other wives? Had he moved jointly earned business profits into accounts inaccessible to some members of the family? Had he prepared dissolution-oriented legal structures before any wife had formally left? Had he used the language of spiritual family governance to discourage scrutiny of legal documents? To each question, Kody answered in the language people use when the truth exists, but they hope precision will blur it. He said he did not recall. He said that was not the intent. He said the situation was more complicated than it seemed. He said people were interpreting internal family management as something sinister only because relationships had soured. Then the attorney placed a printed email in front of him. It was dated March 2019. The courtroom leaned forward almost physically as one body. The attorney asked Kody whether he had written the email. In it, he had allegedly stated, in substance, that if Christine kept the house, she did not have the nerve to fight him legally. When asked again whether he had written it, Kody did not deny it. He only said it was being taken out of context. The attorney's reply cut through the room like broken glass. What, he asked, was the correct context for strategizing against a wife while publicly claiming to love her? No one spoke. No one needed to. It was one of those moments when the silence itself becomes a verdict of emotion, if not yet of law. Kody stared at the page. He seemed to understand that there are some sentences a person can never fully walk back once they have been read aloud in a courtroom. The problem with written strategy is that it preserves intent better than memory ever can. The cross-examination intensified. The attorney moved to the subject of the LLCs and property transfers. Why had these structures been established? Why had names shifted? Why had some wives been told arrangements were temporary, spiritual, or clerical when the paperwork showed durable legal control elsewhere? Kody grew visibly irritated. He insisted the moves had been made to secure the family. The attorney pounced on the wording. Which family? The spiritual family in the abstract? Or the legal unit he had consolidated around himself and Robyn? That question pierced him. Something in Kody snapped. He slammed his hand against the witness stand and erupted in anger, shouting that they had betrayed him, that all of them had, that he had given them structure, and they had repaid him with rebellion. It was not the language of heartbreak. It was the language of ownership. The language of someone who believes obedience is the natural return on provision. The judge cut him off with open disdain. He was not entitled to tantrums in her courtroom, she said. A brief recess was ordered, but the break did not undo what had just happened. In a few seconds of uncontrolled fury, Kody had exposed the logic beneath his entire defense. He did not simply feel misunderstood. He felt defied. And that is a very different thing. As officers and court staff reset the room, the emotional current shifted again. Robyn, seated toward the rear, looked stricken. Not merely upset, but stunned in the way people sometimes appear when a truth they privately suspected is finally spoken in a form they can no longer deny. Janelle leaned toward Christine and murmured that he had just lost the jury, speaking metaphorically, since this was not that kind of trial. Christine answered that he had lost them a long time ago. It was a quiet exchange, but it carried the whole history of the family inside it. When proceedings resumed, the attorney introduced financial records. These were not vague summaries or broad accusations. They were expense reports, account flows, discretionary charges, and delivery documentation. Luxury purchases, furnishings, trips, high-cost comforts billed to family-linked accounts, but delivered disproportionately, and in some instances exclusively, to Robyn's household. The contrast was brutal. Years of rhetoric about shared sacrifice now stood beside line items suggesting selective comfort financed through collective resources. Kody tried to defend himself by saying he had worked harder than anyone and deserved some comfort. It was a catastrophic answer. Even Mary, who had spent years trying to preserve dignity in the ruins of old attachment, looked away. Disgust moved through the room, not as loud condemnation, but as the heavy withdrawal of sympathy. Then came an audio recording. It had been filed recently, and once admitted, it was played in court. The quality was imperfect, but the voice was clear enough. During what appeared to be a family meeting from 2020, Kody could be heard telling the wives that if they did not like how he did things, they could leave, but they should not expect to take anything with them. The effect of that recording was devastating. Spoken words have a force that even the harshest transcript sometimes lacks. In the recording, his tone was not impulsive rage. It was calm, smug, assured. The confidence of someone convinced the threat would hold. Christine gripped the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. Janelle closed her eyes. Robyn covered her mouth. The spectators fell into that rare kind of courtroom silence where people are not merely listening, but recalibrating everything they thought they understood. What the recording revealed was not just entitlement. It was coercive architecture. Stay under my terms or leave empty-handed. Accept the system or lose access to the life your labor helped build. This was not the accidental unfairness of a messy household. It sounded like governance by leverage. When the recording ended, no one rushed to fill the silence. Even the air seemed heavy. The judge then asked Kody one final question in that session. Did he believe he had treated his wives justly? For the first time all day, his answer came quieter. He said he thought he had done what he had to do to hold them together. The sentence was not an apology. It was something more revealing and perhaps more tragic, the confession of a worldview. In his mind, holding them together had justified everything. Pressure, control, unevenness, secrecy, legal concentration, emotional coercion. He did not describe fairness, he described preservation of the structure. And in that distinction lay the heart of the case. When he stepped down from the stand, the courtroom did not explode into noise. It did something worse for him. It absorbed what he had shown. Public disgrace often arrives not with shouting, but with comprehension. The people present had now heard the documents, the testimony, the excuses, the outburst, the recording, and the final admission. Piece by piece, the narrative of noble family leadership had been replaced by a portrait of domination dressed in the language of order. Outside the courthouse, headlines were already beginning to take shape in real time. Commentators debated whether the case represented the collapse of a patriarchal household, a cautionary tale about informal family structures and legal vulnerability, or a landmark confrontation over spiritualized labor and financial control. But inside, there was still one more stage ahead. The judge announced that the final session would begin the following day and would focus on restitution, custody, and longer-term decisions. The new allegations circling Robyn had not yet been resolved, but they had deepened the atmosphere of instability around Kody's defense. Nothing felt secure anymore. Not the assets. Not the narratives. Not the loyalties. As the parties exited, Christine crossed paths with Kody. She paused for a fraction of a second, not theatrically, not to gloat, but with the stillness of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of the person in front of her. Then she told him that he had thought the truth would destroy her, but in the end it had buried him instead. She walked away with Janelle and Mary at her side. Back in private, Kody sat alone, bent forward in his chair, his hands covering his face. For years, he had controlled the story inside the family by controlling movement, access, language, and approval. But courtrooms are cruel to private kingdoms. They force the invisible to become sequential. They turn memory into exhibits. They ask for dates, signatures, transfers, recordings, and intent. And once that process starts, charisma is rarely enough to stop it. By evening, the emotional fallout had spread in all directions. Christine's home felt different now, not peaceful exactly, but unburdened in a way it had not been in years. The children moved around the edges of the moment, aware something monumental was shifting even if they did not yet know the full legal language for it. Janelle reviewed yet another stack of papers, preparing for the final phase with her characteristic steadiness. Mary sat alone with the ache of old illusions dissolving fully at last. Robyn, increasingly isolated, seemed trapped between self-preservation and complicity, between fear of consequence and the unbearable knowledge that she may have participated in structures she had once told herself were simply practical. And over all of it loomed the final day. Not just a hearing. A reckoning. A day when restitution would be argued, custody would be clarified, and the court would decide whether this family's private architecture of faith, dependence, fear, and paperwork could still stand under the pressure of law. The final day arrived under a silence heavier than any shouting that had come before it. The courtroom was full, but the energy had changed. This was no longer about shocking testimony. It was about consequences. Christine, Janelle, and Mary sat with a new steadiness, no longer looking like women waiting to be believed, but women who had already told the truth and were now waiting for the law to catch up. Robyn entered quietly and stayed behind Kody, while Kody himself looked stripped of every performance that had once protected him. He had no charm left, no anger left that could help him, and no control left over the room. When the judge began reading the ruling, every sound seemed to disappear. She found in favor of Christine on the claims of financial misconduct and civil fraud, ordering Kody to pay substantial restitution and surrender any claims over the disputed Flagstaff property and the trust assets tied to it. The ruling on custody followed just as sharply. The minor children would remain with their mothers unless a valid appeal could establish otherwise. Kody reacted with visible anger, but his words no longer carried power. They sounded like the last echoes of a man who had already lost the structure he spent years trying to defend. Christine did not celebrate. She lowered her head and exhaled, not in triumph, but in release. Janelle stayed composed, though the tightness in her face finally softened. Mary looked shaken, as if the verdict had confirmed something painful she had known in fragments for years, but never wanted to fully name. It was not joy that moved through the women. It was freedom mixed with grief, the kind that comes when justice arrives too late to restore the past, but early enough to save the future. Then, just as the judge prepared to close the session, a sealed statement was delivered to the bench. The courtroom froze as she opened it and read. Her expression changed almost immediately. When she looked up, her eyes settled on Robyn. The judge announced that the sworn statement, supported by notarized documents, alleged Robyn had prior knowledge of forged signatures and had participated in the reassignment of at least 2 LLCs while giving misleading testimony under oath. The room erupted in gasps. Kody turned toward her in disbelief, and Robyn, trembling now, whispered the one sentence that shattered whatever alliance remained between them. She had not wanted to go down with him. The judge restored order and stated that if the new allegations were verified, they could lead to separate proceedings involving perjury and accessory fraud. Christine looked at Robyn, not with rage, but with a kind of exhausted sadness, and told her softly that she had made her choices. Robyn collapsed back into her seat, and for the first time in the entire case, she looked less like a protected wife and more like a person standing alone before the cost of complicity. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Christine, Janelle, and Mary walked down the steps side by side. When Christine finally spoke, she said the fight had never been about revenge. It had been about truth and about making sure their daughters would never believe silence was the price of love. Janelle added that what they had built was supposed to lift everyone, not trap them. Mary, with tears in her eyes, said she had once only wanted to be loved, but now she wanted to be free. Those words carried farther than any headline. By evening, the story had moved beyond the courthouse and into the quiet spaces where real endings begin. Christine sat with her children in a home that finally felt like hers. Janelle prepared for a future built in her own name. Mary began writing the first lines of a life no longer organized around waiting. Robyn said nothing, her silence now heavier than words. And Kody, alone with the ruins of everything he tried to control, was left facing the one force he could never dominate forever, the truth. That was how it ended. Not with the family restored, and not with the pain erased, but with the mask torn away. The kingdom he built on obedience, fear, and secrecy did not survive the light. The women he thought would remain divided walked away together. And in the end, the story no longer belonged to the man who ruled it. The final part is closed. Thanks for watching this video. Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe,